The rain had been falling on Thornmere for 3 days when they buried Alfred Harrow, and by the time the last handful of earth struck the coffin lid, most of the village had already decided how the will would read. Beatrice Harrow stood a little apart from the others at the graveside, her black umbrella tilted against a wind that came straight off the fells, and she did not weep. She had wept quietly, alone in the days before, sitting in her grandfather's cold kitchen with his reading glasses still folded on the table and a half-drunk mug of tea he would never finish. But here, in front of the Harrows and the Rennocks and half of Thornmere's parish council, she kept her face still. Her grandfather had taught her that. "Never let them read you, Bee," he used to say, turning over a spadeful of black soil in his cracked hands. "A man who shows you everything he's got has already lost the bargain." She was 29 years old, with dark hair pinned back and a coat 2 winters out of fashion, and to everyone watching, she looked exactly like what they believed her to be. The granddaughter who had gone off to some university down south, come back with letters after her name and nothing to show for them, and would now be waiting, like the rest of them, to see what the old man had left. "Poor thing," murmured Vivienne Harrow to her son, not quite quietly enough. "All that education and she still can't afford a decent coat." Miles Harrow smirked. He was 34, handsome in the loose, well-fed way of a man who had never once been told no, and he already wore the confidence of an heir. His father, Gerald, stood beside him, Alfred's only living son, a heavy-set man with a florid face and a habit of jingling the coins in his trouser pocket when he was pleased. He was jingling them now. The solicitor, Mr. Pettigrew, had said the reading would be at Harrow House the following afternoon, and so the following afternoon they all came. Harrow House was not a grand place, a solid gray stone farmhouse at the head of the valley, its slate roof green with moss, its windows small against the northern weather. But it sat on the good land, 400 acres of grazing that rolled gently down toward the river, sheep-cropped and profitable, the land that had kept the Harrows for 6 generations. Everyone in that low-ceilinged parlor knew exactly what they had come for. Gerald had already spoken to a man in Kendal about drainage. Miles had already, in the privacy of his own imagination, sold the far pastures to a developer and bought a flat in Leeds. Beatrice sat by the window in her grandfather's chair. Nobody else had wanted it, and watched the rain run down the glass. Mr. Pettigrew was a small, precise man who cleaned his spectacles twice before he began, as though the reading of a dead man's wishes required a clear view of the living. He set out his papers. He cleared his throat. And then, in a dry voice that gave nothing away, he read the last will and testament of Alfred Edward Harrow. The house went to Gerald. That was expected. The boy who stayed usually got the house. The 400 acres of grazing, the flocks, the machinery, the account at the bank in Kendal that had turned out to be healthier than anyone quite dared hope, all of it to Gerald, and after Gerald to Miles. Vivienne let out a small, satisfied breath. Miles reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. There were smaller things. A gold pocket watch to a cousin in Carlisle, a sum of money to the parish church for the upkeep of the graves. The old man's books, and there were a great many of them, more than anyone had ever thought to wonder about, were to be given to whoever wanted them, and nobody in that room wanted them. "And finally," said Mr. Pettigrew, turning to the last page, "to my granddaughter Beatrice Ann Harrow." The whole room turned to look at her. Gerald's coins fell silent in his pocket. "I leave the land known as Blackmore Rise, being some 212 acres lying to the north of the beck, together with the derelict buildings thereon, and my full confidence that she, of all of them, will know what to do with it." There was a silence, and then Miles laughed. It began as a snort he tried to hold back, and then it broke free, and once it had broken free, the others could not help themselves. Gerald's shoulders shook. Vivienne pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, but her eyes were bright with a cruel delight she made no real effort to hide. Beatrice sat very still. Because everyone in that room knew Blackmore Rise. Everyone in Thornmere knew it. 212 acres of poisoned ground on the north side of the valley, a place where nothing had grown properly in living memory, where the soil ran a strange rustandash color and the beck that trickled through it left orange stains on the stones. 60 years ago there had been a works there, the Rennick Tannery and Chemical Yard, and when it closed it had left behind a stretch of dead earth that no farmer would touch and no one would buy. The council had surveyed it once, decided remediation would cost more than the land could ever be worth, and quietly forgotten about it. Children were told not to play there. Sheep that strayed onto it were fetched back quickly. It was, by every measure anyone in that valley used, worthless, worse than worthless, a liability, a stretch of land that cost money and fences and cost nothing but grief. And the old man had left it to her. "Well," said Gerald, wiping his eyes, still chuckling, "there's your inheritance, love, 200 acres of poison and a barn that's falling down." He shook his head with enormous good humor. "I always said the old boy had a queer sense of what mattered. Left the sensible things to sensible people, and gave the university girl a pile of muck to play with." "To think about," said Miles, grinning, "with her doctorate. What was it in again, B? Dirt?" "Soil," said Beatrice quietly. It was the first word she had spoken all afternoon. "Soil," Miles repeated, delighted. "Well, you've got 200 acres of it. Best soil in the county for growing nothing at all." Vivienne laughed again, that bright, cruel laugh, and the whole room laughed with her. And for a long moment Beatrice Harrow sat in her grandfather's chair while her family laughed at her, and she looked not at any of them but out of the window, up the valley, to where the north slope rose gray and barren under the falling rain. She did not tell them what she was thinking. She did not tell them that she had spent 7 years, 3 for her degree, 4 more for the doctorate and the fellowship after it, studying precisely the kind of ground that lay under Blackmore Rise. That her thesis, which not one of them had read or asked to read, had been on the remediation of heavy metal contaminated soils using engineered fungal networks, and that she had published 2 papers on the subject in journals whose names would have meant nothing to anyone in that parlor. She did not tell them that she had turned down a research post in Zurich the previous spring for reasons she had not fully understood herself at the time, except that her grandfather had rung her one night and said, in his slow, careful way, "Come home when you're done, B. There's work here for the right sort of eyes." And she did not tell them the other thing, the thing she had known since she was 14 years old, since the summer her grandfather had walked her up to the top of Blackmore Rise and stood her at the edge of the dead ground and said, so softly she had almost missed it, "They didn't kill this land by accident, love. And one day someone's going to have to prove it." She kept all of that behind her still face, and she let them laugh. When the laughter had run itself out, Mr. Pettigrew coughed and gathered his papers, and the family drifted into the kind of loud, pleased conversation that follows a will that has gone the way people wanted. Gerald was already talking about drainage. Miles had cornered the solicitor to ask about the account in Kendall. Vivienne was making a slow circuit of the parlor, appraising the furniture with the eye of a woman deciding what was hers now. Beatrice rose from the chair, and no one much noticed her go. In the hallway, pulling on her coat, she was stopped by a voice she had not expected. "Miss Harrow." She turned. A man stood in the doorway of the small back room that had been her grandfather's study, a man she had noticed at the funeral and taken for one of the many strangers who come to a well-known old farmer's burial. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, in a good dark suit that had not come from anywhere in Thornmere, and he held a leather document case under one arm with the particular care of a man who knows what is in it. "My name is Edmund Clay," he said. "I was a friend of your grandfather's, rather an old one." He paused. "I don't expect you'll remember, but we met once. You were very small." "I'm afraid I don't," said Beatrice. "No matter." He glanced back over his shoulder into the parlor, where Gerald's laugh boomed out again, and something crossed his face that was not quite distaste but stood close beside it. Might I have a few minutes of your time? Not here. Your grandfather asked me some while ago to give you certain things privately after he was gone. It seemed to matter a great deal to him that it be done privately. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, her family divided up the world. In front of her stood a stranger in a good suit holding a leather case and speaking her grandfather's name as though it weighed something. "There's a tarum in the village," she said. "The copper kettle. It'll be quiet at this hour." "I know it," said Edmund Clay. "I'll follow you down." The copper kettle was indeed quiet, a low room with a few empty tables and a fire that had been let go gray, run by a widow named Mrs. Alderton, who brought them a pot of tea and then retreated, with tremendous discretion, to the back. Rain streaked the small windows. Beatrice sat across from the stranger and waited, because her grandfather had also taught her the value of waiting. Edmund Clay poured the tea before he spoke. It was, she would think later, the act of a careful man buying himself a moment to choose his words. "I was your grandfather's solicitor once," he said. "Long before Pettigrew handled the farm, the ordinary business, the will you heard read today. I handled something else, something Alfred kept apart from all the ordinary business of his life for the best part of 40 years. He set down the pot. "I retired 6 years ago, but some obligations don't retire, and this is one of them." He laid the leather case on the table between them and unbuckled it, but he did not yet open it. "What do you know," he asked, "about Blackmore Rise?" "I know it's poisoned," said Beatrice. "I know the Rennick tannery ran there until the 60s. I know the soil's carrying a heavy metal load high enough that nothing much grows, and that the runoff into the beck is why the stones downstream are stained." She kept her voice even. "I know the council decided 60 years ago it wasn't worth cleaning up, and that everyone in the valley has treated it as a wasteland ever since. And I know my grandfather left it to me, and my family thinks that's the funniest thing they've heard in years." "Yes," said Edmund Clay, "they would." He folded his hands. "And what do you believe about it, Miss Harrow? That isn't quite the same as what you know." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain fell steadily on the empty street. "I believe," she said slowly, "that when the Rennick works closed, the contamination they left behind was worse than anyone was ever told. I believe the survey the council did in the 60s either missed things or was made to miss things. And I believe my grandfather thought the same, because he told me once when I was a girl that the land didn't die by accident, and that someday someone would have to prove it." She met the old solicitor's eyes. "I've spent most of my adult life learning how to prove exactly that kind of thing. I don't think that's a coincidence, Mr. Clay. I think my grandfather pointed me at it on purpose, and I think you're about to tell me I was right." For the first time, Edmund Clay smiled, a small, tired, entirely genuine smile. "He said you'd see it faster than anyone," he murmured. "He was right about that, as he was right about most things and stubborn about the rest." He opened the case at last. "Alfred Harrow spent 40 years quietly collecting proof, Miss Harrow. He simply never had the means, or the science, or, frankly, the courage to use it, while the people who'd built their fortune on that land were still strong enough to bury him for trying. He decided in the end that the fight belonged to someone with cleaner hands and better tools than his. He drew out the first of several thick folders and set it before her. He left you the land, but he left you rather more than the land." Beatrice looked down at the folder. Written across it, in her grandfather's careful, old-fashioned hand, were 3 words that made the breath go still in her chest. "For B, everything." "Before you open that," said Edmund Clay, and now his voice was very low and very serious, "I'm obliged to tell you one thing your grandfather insisted I say to you plainly in these words before you saw a single page." He waited until she looked up. "The Rennicks know the land isn't worthless. They have always known. And the moment they understand that you know it too, you will stop being a joke to them and start being a problem." The fire ticked in the grate. Somewhere at the back of the tarum, a cup was set gently on a saucer. "The Rennicks," said Beatrice, The tannery Rennicks, they're still. Oh, very much still, said Edmund Clay. You know the name in a different shape now. The tannery was the beginning of it 3 generations back. The family put the money into other things as the tanning trade died: chemicals, then property, then a great deal of property. These days they call themselves Rennick Holdings, and they are, I should think, one of the largest privately held development concerns in the north of England. He tapped the folder gently. And for the last 2 years, quietly and through intermediaries so that no one connects the offers back to them, they have been trying to buy Blackmore Rise from your grandfather. Every offer he refused. Every offer, Miss Harrow, was for a great deal more money than a stretch of poisoned wasteland could possibly be worth to a company that only wanted to be rid of an old embarrassment. He let that sit. Men don't pay a fortune to bury an embarrassment, he said. They pay it to bury a secret, and they pay it, sometimes, to sit on top of something they've realized is worth more than they ever imagined, and would rather no one else realize at all. Beatrice Harrow put her hand flat on the folder her grandfather had left her. Through the window she could just see, far up the valley in the last gray light, the northern slope rising toward Blackmore Rise, 212 acres of ground that the whole world had agreed was dead, that her own family had laughed at her for inheriting not 2 hours before. She did not laugh, she did not smile, but something moved behind her still face, something her grandfather would have recognized and been glad of and been a little afraid of too. "Tell me everything, Mr. Clay," she said, "from the beginning." And outside, the rain kept falling on the valley, and up on the north slope the dead land waited, keeping its secret a little longer. Edmund Clay talked for the better part of an hour, and the fire in the copper kettle had burned down to embers by the time he finished, and Mrs. Alderton had twice come and twice gone, sensing something in the stillness of the 2 figures at the corner table that told her not to interrupt. He began with the tannery. The Rennick Works had opened in 1911, he said, on land the family already owned at the head of the valley, where the beck could carry away what a tannery needed to carry away. For half a century it had prospered. Leather from the Rennick yard had gone into army boots in 2 wars, into saddlery and luggage and the seats of expensive motor cars, and the family that owned it had grown rich in the quiet, unshowy way of northern industrialists who did not care to be talked about. But tanning is a filthy trade. It uses chromium and arsenic and a dozen other substances that do not leave the ground once they enter it, and in those years no one asked a tannery where its waste went, because everyone already knew. Into the beck, into the pits behind the yard, into the earth. By the time the works closed in 1963, said Edmund Clay, the ground at Blackmore Rise had been absorbing the discharge of a chemical operation for 52 years. The soil there isn't merely poor, Miss Harrow. It is one of the most heavily contaminated pieces of private land in the north of England, and the Rennicks have always known precisely how bad it is, because they made it so. There was a survey, said Beatrice, in the 60s. The council. There was a survey, Clay agreed, and this is the first thing your grandfather wanted you to understand, so I'll say it carefully. The survey was real. It was carried out by a firm of consulting engineers, and it concluded that the contamination at Blackmore Rise was severe but contained, confined to the top few feet of soil, stable, not migrating, not a danger to the wider valley so long as no one farmed it or built on it. On the strength of that survey, the council decided remediation wasn't warranted, the land was written off as waste, and the whole matter was closed. He paused. The survey was wrong. And your grandfather came to believe, over many years, that it was wrong on purpose. He drew a second folder from the case, and opened it to a page of yellowed paper covered in columns of figures in a hand Beatrice did not recognize. This is where it becomes a story about your family and not only about the Rennicks, Clay said. The man who carried out the fieldwork for that survey in 1964, the man who actually took the soil samples and the water readings, day after day, up on that slope, was a young technician named Thomas Harrow. He looked at her. "Your grandfather's younger brother, your great-uncle." Beatrice went very still. "I never knew he had a brother." Few people did by the end. Thomas Harrow was clever, ambitious, and poor, and the Rennicks were the biggest employers in the valley. When the survey firm needed local men who knew the ground, Thomas took the work gladly. And in the course of that work, taking his samples where he was told and being a careful young man, a good many places he wasn't told, he found something that frightened him. Clay turned the page. He found that the contamination wasn't contained at all. It was moving. It was deep. And it was migrating along a seam of permeable rock that ran north and east under the slope. Away from Blackmore Rise, away from the old tannery land the Rennicks had already written off, and directly under the good grazing land on the far side of the beck. The land, Miss Harrow, that 6 generations of Harrows have farmed. The land your grandfather left to your Uncle Gerald this afternoon. The rain had softened to a fine drizzle against the window. Beatrice heard her own voice come out steady, which surprised her. "He found that the poison was spreading under our land, and the survey said it wasn't." "The survey said it was contained," said Clay, "because the men who commissioned it needed it to say so. If the true finding had been published, that a Rennick operation had contaminated not only its own ground but was actively poisoning the farmland and the water supply of half the valley, the liability would have ruined them. Not embarrassed them, ruined them. Clean up on that scale in those years with damages to every farmer and household affected. It would have swallowed the entire Rennick fortune and more. So the report was written to say what it needed to say, and the true data, Thomas's data, the deep samples, the migration readings, never appeared in it." "What happened to Thomas?" Edmund Clay was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Harrow died in the autumn of 1964, he said. "He fell from the crag above Blackmore Rise where he'd gone, his family were told, to take a last set of readings. The inquest returned misadventure. He was 26. He closed the folder gently. Your grandfather was 19, and he never for the rest of his life believed that his brother's death was an accident. He couldn't prove otherwise. He was a boy and the Rennicks were the Rennicks and it was 1964. But he kept everything. Thomas's notebooks, his sample logs, the letters. He kept them for 60 years and he added to them quietly, patiently, whenever a piece of the truth surfaced. And when he grew old and understood he'd run out of time to finish it himself, he began to look for the one person in the family who might have both the science to prove what Thomas found and the will to see it through. He looked at her across the cold tea. "He found you, Miss Harrow. He didn't leave you a pile of poison to laugh at. He left you a case that's been waiting 60 years for someone equipped to fight it, and the land it happened on, so that it would be yours to fight for, and no one could tell you it was none of your business." For a long time Beatrice said nothing. She was thinking of an old man in a cold kitchen, of reading glasses folded on a table, of a voice on the telephone the previous spring, "Come home when you're done, B. There's work here for the right sort of eyes." She had thought he meant the farm. She understood now that he had meant something he had never once been able to say to her directly, because to say it aloud was to make her a target, and he had wanted her to choose it with her eyes open, in her own time, after he was safely beyond their reach. "Why now?" she said at last. "It's 60 years. If the Rennicks buried this so well, why does it matter now? Old contamination, old survey, everyone who signed the false report is surely dead." "Ah," said Edmund Clay, and something sharpened in his tired face. "That is the part your grandfather would have wanted you to hear last, because it's the part that turns a historical injustice into a present danger." He drew out the final folder, and this one was new, the paper crisp, the documents recent, some of them printed rather than typed. 2 years ago, Rennick Holdings applied to the council for outline permission to develop the entire head of the valley, 400 houses, a retail park, a link road. It is the largest development ever proposed in this district, and it will make the Rennick family, who are already very rich, immeasurably richer. He spread the papers. And the development is planned to sit precisely across the old tannery land, the contaminated slope. And this is the point, Miss Harrow, across the seam of poisoned ground that runs north under the farmland. To build there, they will excavate it. They will dig into contamination they have spent 60 years swearing does not exist, on the strength of a survey they know to be false, and they will move that poison and disturb it, and expose it, in the middle of a valley full of people. They can't build on contaminated land without a fresh assessment, said Beatrice. The regulations now. They've had a fresh assessment done, said Clay. A new environmental survey commissioned by Rennick Holdings from a consultancy of their choosing, submitted to the council 8 months ago in support of the application. I have a copy. He slid a bound report across the table. It concludes that the contamination at the site is minor, historical, contained, and readily manageable with standard measures. It reaches, in other words, in 2024, exactly the same false conclusion that the 1964 survey reached, and for exactly the same reason. He tapped it. Your grandfather obtained this 11 months ago, and it was, I think, what finally decided him. He realized that the lie his brother died over was not a piece of history. It was about to be used again to put 400 families to live on top of poisoned ground so that the Rennicks could add one more fortune to all the others. His voice was very quiet now. He could not stop it. He hadn't the science to challenge a modern survey, nor the years left to fight the appeal, but he hoped that you might. Beatrice reached out and drew the report toward her. She opened it. She read, and as she read, the old solicitor watched something happen to her face that he had watched happen, decades before, to her grandfather's. A stillness settling over it that was not calm but the opposite of calm, held rigidly in check. The look of a person who has just been shown the exact shape of the thing they were built to fight. The consultancy's name was on the cover. The methodology was on page 4. The sampling plan was on page 7, and it took Beatrice, with 7 years of specialist training behind her, less than 2 minutes to see what was wrong with it. The samples had all been taken shallow, none deeper than a meter, none along the northeast seam, none where the migration would show. It was not incompetence. It was too clean to be incompetence. Whoever had designed that sampling plan had known exactly where the poison was, and had drawn the map so that not one sample would ever find it. They did it again, she said softly. The same trick 60 years apart. They sampled everywhere the ground is clean and nowhere it isn't, and they called it a survey. Yes. And on the strength of this, the council is going to grant permission. The application goes before the planning committee in 11 weeks, said Edmund Clay. The officers are minded to recommend approval. There is no organized objection worth the name. The Rennicks are, by every appearance, about to win. He closed the leather case. Unless someone with the qualifications to be believed, and the standing to be heard, and the evidence to make it undeniable, stands up and proves that the ground is not what they say it is. He looked at her steadily. You own the land at the center of it, Miss Harrow. You hold 60 years of your family's collected proof. And you are, as far as I'm aware, one of a very small number of people in this country qualified to demonstrate scientifically what Thomas Harrow died trying to show with a notebook and a boy's honesty. Your grandfather gave you every piece of it. What you do with it is entirely your own choice. He was insistent about that. I was to give you everything, tell you everything, and then leave you to decide, owing no one anything. He stood and buckled the case and left it, she realized, on the table, sliding it across to her side. That's yours now, all of it, he drew on his coat. I'll give you my card. Whatever you decide, there are things a solicitor should do properly, and I take it as a kindness to your grandfather to do them for you, at no charge, for as long as I'm able. He set the card beside the case. But I'd urge you to decide quickly, and I'd urge you, Alfred was most emphatic about this, to tell no one in your family what you know. Not yet. Not the truth about the land, and above all not the truth about Thomas. Your grandfather trusted a great many people in his long life. He did not, at the end, trust all of his own blood. Make of that what you will." And with that, Edmund Clay tipped his head, thanked Mrs. Alderton for the tea, and went out into the drizzle. And Beatrice Harrow sat alone in the darkening terrace with a leather case full of a dead man's 40-year secret, and the whole shape of her life quietly rearranging itself around her. She did not go back to Harrow House that night. She had a room at the Fleece, the small inn on the village square, taken for the week of the funeral, and she carried the leather case up to it under her coat and locked the door and did not come down for dinner. She spread the folders across the narrow bed, and she read, and the reading took her most of the night. She read Thomas Harrow's notebooks first. His hand was small and neat and grew, over the months of 1964, steadily more troubled, the entries changing from dry columns of readings to short cramped sentences in the margins. Depth samples inconsistent with surface, told to disregard. And later, asked Mr. R why deep set not in report. Was told the deep set is unreliable. It is not unreliable. It is the only reliable thing here. And in the last notebook, in an entry dated 4 days before he died, a single line underscored twice: "If they will not put it in the report, I will put it somewhere they cannot reach." She read her grandfather's letters, 60 years of them, to solicitors and archives, and twice to the council, each politely rebuffed. She read the correspondence with Edmund Clay, careful and coded, a decades-long conversation between two men keeping a fire alive with no fuel but patience. And she read, last, a letter addressed to her, in the familiar old hand, that she had not known was in the case until she reached the bottom of the final folder and found it there in a sealed envelope with her name on it. She held it a long while before she opened it. It began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Edmund has kept his word. And you know now the thing I could never tell you to your face, because to tell you was to put you in it, and I would not do that to you without your leave. I have carried this since I was younger than you are now. My brother Thomas found the truth and they killed him for it, and I could never prove either the truth or the killing, and I have spent a lifetime being called a bitter old man who couldn't let his brother's accident lie. Perhaps I am bitter, but I am not wrong, and now nor are you, because you have seen the same thing I have, and you have the eyes to see what I never could, the science of it, the how and the why and the proof. I am not asking you to fight them. A man has no right to ask that of his granddaughter from beyond the grave, and I won't. I am giving you the truth and the means and the standing, and then I am getting out of your way. If you read all this and decide it is too much, that your life is your own and this fight is an old man's ghost, then you sell the land, take whatever you can get and go and live well, and I will not blame you, and neither should you blame yourself. I mean that, B. I mean it entirely. But if you are the girl I think you are, the girl who stood at the edge of the dead ground when she was 14, and asked me not whether it was dangerous but why nothing grew there, and whether it could be made to grow again, then I think you already know what you're going to do. You always did want to make dead things live. They will underestimate you. Let them. It was the only weapon Thomas and I ever had, and we never learned to use it. You will be cleverer than your anger. Be more patient than their money. And when the time comes to show them what you are, show them all at once in the open, where they can't bury it. The land is yours. The truth is yours. I love you more than I ever managed to say. Grandfather. Beatrice Harrow folded the letter and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small dark room, and for the second time in 3 days she wept, quietly, alone. And when she had finished, she washed her face in the little basin, and she looked at herself in the spotted mirror, and she made her decision. Though in truth, as the old man had known, it had been made for her 14 years ago on the edge of the dead ground, and everything since had only been her getting ready. She would fight them, but she would do it his way. She would let them underestimate her. She would be patient, and when she struck, she would strike once in the open with proof that could not be buried. The next morning she did 3 things. First, she telephoned Edmund Clay and told him her decision, and he was quiet on the line for a moment and then said only, he'd be very glad, in a voice that was not entirely steady, and then briskly, that he would begin at once making certain her ownership of Blackmore Rise was watertight, because the first thing the Rennocks would try when they understood was to find a flaw in her title. Second, she went down to breakfast at the Fleece and sat among the locals and let it be known, mildly, to anyone who asked, that she supposed she'd hang on to the odd bit of land her grandfather had left her, sentimental reasons, family ground, nothing that would come to anything, and that she'd be staying in the village a while to sort out his affairs. She said it lightly, a little ruefully, the university girl with her worthless acres, and she watched it travel, as she knew it would, out of the inn and around the village, and within a day or two, she had no doubt, to the ears it was meant for. Third, she drove up the valley alone, past Harrow House, over the old stone bridge, and up the rough track to the north slope, and she stood at last where she had stood at 14, at the edge of Blackmore Rise, and looked out over 212 acres of dead ground that was now hers. It was worse than she remembered, and better. Worse, because with a trained eye she could read the contamination in the very color of it, the rust-and-dash staining of the soil, the sickly margin where even the hardiest weeds gave up, the orange bloom on the stones of the beck. Better, because she could also see, now, exactly what her grandfather had seen when he sent her south to learn, that everything wrong with this ground was, in principle, fixable, not cheaply, not quickly. But by the science she had spent 7 years learning, this dead land could be made to live. The engineered fungal networks she had studied, mycelial systems bred to draw heavy metals up out of soil and lock them safely away, could, over years, do to this slope what no one in the valley believed possible. She could clean it. She could prove exactly how poisoned it was in the proving, and she could clean it. And at the end of it she would hold not a liability but 200 acres of remediated, developable, valuable land at the head of a valley, where land was about to become worth a very great deal indeed. That was the thing none of them had grasped, not her family, laughing in the parlor, and not, she suspected, the Rennocks either, not fully. They thought Blackmore Rise was worthless because it was poisoned, but its poison was the only thing keeping it cheap, and she was the one person in the valley who could take the poison away. The moment she did, the dead land at the center of the largest development site in the district would become the most valuable single holding in it. Her grandfather had left her a pile of muck to play with, Gerald had said. He had left her, Beatrice understood, standing on the cold slope in the morning wind, a fortune that only she could unlock, wrapped inside a weapon that only she could fire, guarding a truth that only she could prove, and he had trusted her to work out in her own time which of the three mattered most. She knelt at the edge of the dead ground and took, from her coat pocket, the small steel trowel and the row of sample tubes she had brought up from her grandfather's study that morning, and she began, quietly and methodically, to take the first samples of her own, deep ones, along the northeast seam, exactly where 60 years of Rennick surveys had been so careful never to dig. Down in the valley, unseen, the smoke rose from the chimney of Harrow House, where her family were dividing up an inheritance they believed they understood. And 11 weeks away, the planning committee waited. The samples went south, packed in a cold box, to a laboratory in Manchester that Beatrice had used during her fellowship and trusted absolutely. An independent facility with no possible connection to Thornmere, to the council, or to any interest that might wish the results a particular way. She paid for accelerated analysis out of her own thin savings, and she asked for the full heavy metal panel at every depth, and she asked, especially, for the chromium speciation, because it was the chromium that would tell the story. Trivalent chromium is the kind that sits harmlessly in a great many soils. Hexavalent chromium is the kind that moves, and poisons water and causes cancer, and it was the kind a tannery produces, and it was the kind that the Rennick surveys, both of them, 60 years apart, had been so very careful never to look for at depth. While she waited for the results, she did the unglamorous work that her grandfather had never had the training to do, and would have loved to watch her do. She read the modern planning application in full, all 400 pages of it, 3 times. She read the officer's preliminary report. She read the transport assessment and the flood assessment and the ecology chapter and the heritage statement. And she read them not for their conclusions but for their gaps, the way a woman who has spent years reviewing other people's science reads for the sample that wasn't taken and the question that wasn't asked. She built over 10 patient days at the little desk in her room at the Fleece, a picture of the whole scheme, what the Rennicks meant to build, where, in what sequence, and, most importantly, which parts of the development required them to excavate the contaminated seam. And she learned the name of the man she would have to beat. His name was Julian Rennick, and he was not what she had expected. She admitted to herself, been carrying a picture in her mind of some coarse northern developer, a Gerald with more money, florid, loud, easy to dislike. Julian Rennick was none of those things. He was 48, Cambridge educated, and he had spent a decade in the city before coming home to take Rennick Holdings from his aging father and turn it from a comfortable regional property firm into something that appeared in the financial pages. He gave money to the county's hospitals and sat on the boards of its charities. He had funded the new wing of the very primary school that half the valley's children attended. When his photograph appeared in the local paper, and it appeared often, it was shaking a nurse's hand or turning a spade of earth at some good works, and beneath it he was described invariably as a benefactor, a job creator, a man who had never forgotten where he came from. He was, in short, precisely the kind of antagonist her grandfather had warned her about without ever naming him, powerful, admired, and utterly convinced of his own decency. Beatrice understood, reading about him, that Julian Rennick did not think of himself as the villain in anyone's story. She suspected he had told himself, quite sincerely, that the old contamination was contained, that the surveys were sound, that the development would do the valley nothing but good. Men like Julian Rennick did not, in her experience, knowingly poison children. They arranged never to be shown the evidence that they were about to, and paid other men to arrange it for them, and kept their own hands clean and their conscience clear. It made them, she thought, more dangerous than any florid brute, not less. A brute could be caught in his own crudeness. A man like Julian Rennick would have to be shown, in the open, in front of everyone, holding proof he could not explain away. And even then he would find a way to believe himself wronged. Her grandfather's words came back to her. Be cleverer than your anger. Be more patient than their money. And when the time comes to show them what you are, show them all at once in the open where they can't bury it. She began to plan for the open. The first contact came sooner than she had thought, and it came, as Edmund Clay had promised, the moment they understood she was not going to sell. It was a Tuesday, 8 days after the funeral, and she was at the little desk with the window open to the gray morning when there was a knock at the door of her room, and Mrs. Alderton's daughter, who helped at the Fleece, said there was a gentleman downstairs asking for her. A Mr. Ashworth, from Rennick Holdings. Beatrice sat still for a moment. Then she closed her folders, slid them under the bed with the leather case, took a single blank notebook and a pen, and went down. Mr. Ashworth was waiting in the empty saloon bar, and he was all warmth. He was in his 50s, prosperously soft, in a good overcoat, and he rose and took her hand in both of his and told her how very sorry he was for her loss, how well thought of Alfred had been, what a character, a real character. He was, he explained, the Land and Acquisitions Director for Rennick Holdings, and he happened to be up in the valley on other business, and he had heard she was staying, and he had thought no more than a courtesy, really, that he might introduce himself. Beatrice let him talk. She had learned from her grandfather and from years of academic committees that a great deal can be gathered simply by declining to fill a silence, and Mr. Ashworth, like most men who arrive with something to sell, filled the silences himself. He came to it gently. He understood she'd inherited the old bit of ground up north of the beck, Blackmore Rise, was it? Sad old place. He didn't mind telling her, one straight talker to another, that it was a millstone. Contaminated, you see, old industrial land. Cost a fortune to do anything with if you even could, which the experts said you couldn't. A liability, really, for a young woman with her life ahead of her. Fences to maintain, insurance, the risk of some rambler wandering onto it and coming to grief and suing. Not the sort of thing anyone would want hanging round their neck. Now, said Mr. Ashworth, leaning in confidingly, it just so happens that Rennick Holdings has an interest in the wider area. You may have heard we've a scheme in mind for the head of the valley. Bring some jobs in, some housing, do the place a power of good. And as part of that, we've a use for one or two odd parcels that on their own aren't worth much to anybody. Blackmore Rise being one. He smiled. We'd take it off your hands. Fair price, more than fair, frankly, given the state of it. You'd walk away with a nice sum and none of the worry, and you'd be helping the valley into the bargain. He named a figure. It was, Beatrice noted without moving her face, a very large figure indeed, far larger than any poisoned wasteland could conceivably be worth to a company that merely wanted it out of the way. It was, in fact, precisely the sort of figure Edmund Clay had described. The price men pay not to be rid of an embarrassment, but to bury a secret and sit on top of something they've realized is worth a fortune. It confirmed, in a single sentence over a bar table, everything the folders under her bed had told her. That's very generous, she said. It's the least we can do, said Mr. Ashworth, pleased. May I ask, said Beatrice, why Rennick Holdings wants it? If it's worthless, I mean. You said yourself it's a millstone, contaminated, can't be built on, costs money to hold. Why would a company want to pay a large sum for a liability? For just a moment, no more than a breath, something flickered behind Mr. Ashworth's warmth. Then it was gone, smoothed over. Access mostly, he said easily. The scheme needs a bit of room for the road and your parcel sits handy for it. And frankly, between us, Mr. Rennick doesn't like loose ends. He'd sooner own the whole head of the valley clean than have odd corners of it in other hands. Tidy-minded he is, always has been. He spread his soft hands. So it's worth a bit more to us than it would be to anyone else. Simple as that. It was a good answer. It was a lie, but it was a good lie, ready-made, and it told her something valuable. They had prepared for this question. They knew the price gave the game away, and they had a story ready to cover it. That was the mark of Julian Rennick's hand, nothing left crude, every awkwardness anticipated and smoothed. I'll think about it, said Beatrice. Mr. Ashworth's smile did not waver, but something in his manner cooled by a single degree. Of course, take your time. He slid a card across the table. Only, and I say this as a friend, I wouldn't take too long. Schemes like ours move on. If the road gets designed around your parcel because we couldn't come to terms, well, then it's just a poisoned field again, isn't it? Worth nothing to anybody, and you've missed your chance to turn it into something. These offers don't sit on the table forever. You understand me? I understand you perfectly, said Beatrice. She walked him to the door and shook his hand and thanked him for coming, the mild, slightly overwhelmed young woman with more education than sense. And she watched him drive off in a car that cost more than her grandfather's flock. And only when he had gone did she allow herself a single thought, quite clear and quite cold. Now they know I'm a problem. She rang Edmund Clay that afternoon and told him everything Ashworth had said, and the old solicitor listened and then was quiet for a while. The threat at the end, he said finally, about the road being designed around your parcel, I'd take that seriously, Miss Harrow, not as bluster. There's a real move behind it. He explained. If Rennick Holdings could not buy Blackmore Rise, and if her land turned out to be genuinely in the way of their scheme, they had a route that people in his trade knew well. They could ask the council to use a compulsory purchase order, to force the sale of her land, at a value the council would set, on the grounds that it was needed for a development of public benefit. And a piece of contaminated wasteland, Clay said grimly, assessed at its current use value, would be valued at almost nothing under a CPO. They could take it from you for a fraction of what Ashworth just offered and call it serving the community, and there'd be very little you could do. Unless, said Beatrice slowly, the land isn't wasteland at all. Unless it's in the middle of being remediated, actively, expensively, by a qualified owner with a serious plan. You can't easily compulsorily purchase land that's the subject of a genuine, funded remediation and development scheme of its own, especially not to hand it to a rival developer. There was a pause on the line. No, said Edmund Clay, and she could hear the smile come back into his voice. No, you can't. That would be a great deal harder for them to justify. That would look to anyone paying attention exactly like what it was. A pause. You've thought about this. I've done little else for 8 days, said Beatrice. Mr. Clay, I need to understand something about money, because it's the one part of this I don't have. To do what I'm planning, to properly remediate Blackmore Rise, to fund the science, to establish the land as a real scheme and not a gesture, costs a great deal that I haven't got. My grandfather left me the land and the truth. He didn't leave me the money to fight with. How did he expect me to pay for any of this? Ah, said Edmund Clay. Yes, he thought you'd ask that, and rather sooner than most. Are you free tomorrow? There's a 4th folder I didn't give you in the tarot. I judged it too much for one sitting. It concerns the money, and it concerns a promise your grandfather made to a man in Zurich 40 years ago that I think you're going to find rather changes your view of what's possible. Beatrice sat up. Zurich, she said. Zurich, Edmund Clay agreed. You turned down a post there last spring, I believe. Your grandfather told me. He laughed about it, actually. Said you'd walked away from Zurich without the least idea that Zurich had been waiting your whole life to be useful to you. A dry chuckle. Come to my office tomorrow, Miss Harrow. Bring good questions. I'll bring the 4th folder. And we'll talk about how a young woman with 200 acres of poison and no money is going to outspend one of the richest families in the north of England. He rang off, and Beatrice Harrow sat for a long time in the fading light with the leather case open on the bed, looking at the 3 folders she thought she had understood, and thinking about a 4th she had not known existed, and about the words her grandfather had written in his letter that she had read as sentiment, and now wondered whether she had read at all. I am giving you the truth, and the means and the standing. The truth was the contamination, the standing was the land, and the means she had assumed the means was her own training, her own science, the thing between her ears. But her grandfather had chosen his words as carefully in death as in life. And means, she thought, looking at the empty space in the case where a 4th folder should have been, might mean something else entirely. She barely slept. The next morning she drove the 18 miles to the market town where Edmund Clay kept a small office above a bookshop, retired, but not so retired that he had given up the 2 rooms and the brass plate and the ancient clerk who brought them tea. He was waiting for her with the 4th folder on the desk, and this one was older than the others, the cardboard soft with handling, and when he opened it the first thing she saw was a photograph. It was black and white, and it showed 2 young men on a mountainside laughing, arms across each other's shoulders, an alpine valley falling away behind them. One of them she knew at once, though he was barely more than a boy, the set of the jaw, the steady eyes, her grandfather. The other was a slight, dark-haired young man with a sharp, clever, kind sort of face. That, said Edmund Clay, is your grandfather in 1961. Before the tannery, before Thomas died, before any of it. He was 20. He'd taken himself off to Switzerland for a year, the only adventure of his whole life. He used to say, the one time he got out of the valley. He worked, he walked in the mountains, and he made one friend that the whole rest of his life turned on. He touched the photograph. The other young man is Anton Brunner, And to understand the money, Miss Harrow, you have to understand what your grandfather did for Anton Brunner in the winter of 1961, and what Anton Brunner spent the next 60 years insisting he owed him for it. Beatrice looked at the two laughing boys on the mountainside and felt the story open beneath her once again, wider than before. "Tell me," she said. Anton Brunner, in the winter of 1961, had gone up into the mountains above the valley where he and Alfred worked, and a storm had come down faster than any forecast, and he had broken his ankle on the ice 2,000 feet above the last village. He would have died there. He should have died there. But a 19-year-old English farm boy who had no business on that mountain in that weather had gone up after him when the local men said it was madness, and had got him down through the night on a sledge of lashed branches, walking and falling and walking again, and had delivered him half frozen but alive to the doctor at dawn. Anton Brunner, said Edmund Clay, went on to become one of the wealthiest men in Switzerland. Pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and this is the part that matters, environmental technology. His firm holds patents on some of the most advanced soil remediation processes in the world. And for 60 years, every Christmas, he wrote to your grandfather, and every letter said in one form or another the same thing. "Alfred, I owe you my life, and one day you will let me pay it, and until you do I remain in your debt." Beatrice looked at the photograph of the two laughing boys. "And my grandfather never let him pay. Never took a penny. It was a point of enormous stubbornness with him, you can imagine. But 3 years ago, when he understood what the Rennicks meant to do, and understood he hadn't the money to stop them, your grandfather did the one thing he had never done in 60 years. Clay drew out a letter more recent, the paper crisp. He wrote to Anton Brunner and called in the debt, not for himself, for you and for the land and for the truth about Thomas. He told Brunner everything, and Brunner, who is old now and frail but sharp as a blade, wrote back within the week. He passed her the reply. Beatrice read it. It was short. It said that Anton Brunner had waited 60 years for Alfred Harrow to let him repay a debt that could not be repaid, and that he was more grateful than Alfred could know to be permitted at last to try. It said that his firm's remediation technology and his firm's money were at the disposal of Alfred's granddaughter, in full, for the cleaning of the poisoned land and the exposing of the men who had poisoned it, not as charity, but as the settlement of a debt of honor 60 years overdue. And it said, at the end, in a shakier hand, a single line, "Your brother did not die for nothing, Alfred. She will see to that. Send her to me when it is time." Beatrice set the letter down. Her hands were not quite steady. "The means," she said quietly. "The means," Edmund Clay agreed. "Your grandfather left you the truth and the standing and the means. The means was never your bank account, Miss Harrow. It was a debt of honor older than your father, held by one of the few men on earth with both the money and the exact technology to do what needs doing, and waiting this whole time for you to be ready to use it." He folded his hands. "Anton Brunner is expecting your call. His people will fund the remediation, provide the technology, and this matters as much as the money, provide the independent scientific credibility that no amount of money can buy. When Beatrice Harrow stands up at that planning committee and says the ground is poisoned, she will not be a grieving granddaughter with a grievance. She will be the qualified scientist directing a fully funded remediation program backed by the Brunner Institute. They will have to take her seriously. That is what your grandfather bought you, with a debt he refused to spend for 60 years, saving it all for this." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the market town went about its small business. "He planned all of it," she said. "The land so I'd have standing, sending me south to learn the science so I'd have the eyes, Brunner so I'd have the means, keeping Thomas secret so I'd choose it freely. He spent his whole life building a weapon he was never going to fire, and he handed it to me finished." Her voice caught, just slightly, "and they laughed at me in the parlor for inheriting a pile of muck." "Yes," said Edmund Clay gently. "They did. Let them keep laughing, Miss Harrow, as long as you can. Your grandfather was quite right about that. It's the only advantage you'll have that money can't take away." The lab results came back from Manchester the same week. They were worse than even the folders had suggested. The hexavalent chromium at depth, along the northeast seam, was present at concentrations that made Beatrice sit down slowly when she read the figures. Not merely above the safe threshold, many times above it. And the migration was live. The deep samples showed the plume had moved measurably further north than Thomas Harrow had recorded 60 years before. It was under the beck. It was under the near edge of the Harrow grazing land. Given time, and given the disturbance that 400 houses worth of excavation would cause, it would be under the water table that half the valley drank from. This was no longer only a story about the past. Beatrice understood, holding the printout, that if the Rennick scheme went ahead as planned, people would be hurt. Not in some abstract, historical, my great uncle was wronged way. Children living in those 400 houses, drinking that water, would be poisoned slowly for years before anyone connected the illnesses to the ground. The lie that had killed Thomas Harrow in 1964 was about to be used to build a village on top of the poison it concealed. She rang Anton Brunner in Zurich that night. He was, as Clay had said, old and frail, his English slow now, but his mind moved like the young man's in the photograph. He listened to her lay out the science, and when she had finished there was a silence on the line, and then he said in his careful accent, "Your grandfather carried me down a mountain in the dark when wiser men said it could not be done. You are asking me whether I will help you carry this. Child, I have waited 60 years to be asked. Send me your data. My people fly to you Monday. We begin." The remediation began quietly, and then it did not stay quiet, and that was exactly as Beatrice intended. For the first weeks it looked like almost nothing. A survey team from the Brunner Institute, proper geotechnical engineers with proper equipment, came and drilled a grid of deep boreholes across Blackmore Rise, mapping the plume in 3 dimensions, documenting everything to a standard that no council and no court could wave away. Beatrice worked alongside them every day, in overalls and boots, and the village watched the university girl playing in her poisoned field and shook its heads fondly, and in the case of certain households, watched with a good deal more attention than fondness. Because word had reached the head of the valley, of course it had, and Julian Rennick was not a stupid man. The second offer came by letter, and it was nearly double the first, and it did not come from Ashworth but on Rennick Holdings' own headed paper. Beatrice declined it, politely, in writing, through Edmund Clay, citing her own remediation and development plans for the site. She could almost feel, across the 18 miles, the moment Julian Rennick read that phrase, my own remediation and development plans, and understood, for the first time, that the woman with the poisoned field was not a loose end to be tidied but an enemy who knew. That was when the antagonist struck. It came, as such things do, from several directions at once, and it was all deniable. A letter arrived from the council's own environmental health department, raising concerns about unauthorized ground disturbance at Blackmore Rise and threatening enforcement. A letter that Edmund Clay traced, with quiet fury, to a counselor who sat on the planning committee and had done a great deal of private business with Rennick Holdings over the years. The Brunner Institute's drilling contractor received an anonymous complaint to the health and safety executive and had to stop work for a week while it was investigated and dismissed. A story appeared in the local paper, the same paper that ran Julian Rennick's good works, about a mystery foreign-funded operation up at Blackmore Rise, hinting darkly that local land was being bought up by outside interests, playing on exactly the village suspicions that a man like Rennick knew how to play. And Beatrice's title to the land was challenged, on an obscure technicality about a boundary from 1958 that Edmund Clay spent 3 weeks and considerable skill demolishing. None of it could be traced to Julian Rennick, All of it bore his fingerprints. It was, Beatrice thought, exactly the campaign her grandfather had warned her of, not crude threats but 100 small, respectable obstacles, each one legal, each one deniable, all of them together meant to grind down a young woman with no money and no allies until she gave up and sold. But she was not a young woman with no money and no allies. She had the Brunner Institute's lawyers and the Brunner Institute's money and Edmund Clay's 60 years of local knowledge, and every obstacle Rennick threw up, they cleared and kept working, and the plume map grew more complete and more damning with every borehole. And through it all Beatrice did the thing her grandfather had told her to do. She stayed quiet. She did not go to the press. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She let Julian Rennick expend himself against her, week after week, and she kept, in a locked case, the growing mountain of proof, and she waited for the one day when all of it could be shown at once in the open, where he could not bury it. The planning committee. There was one more hidden layer, and she found it 3 weeks before the committee met, and it changed the ending. She had been going through Thomas Harrow's last notebook again, the one with the underscored line, "If they will not put it in the report, I will put it somewhere they cannot reach," and she had read it a dozen times as a young man's despairing figure of speech. But she was a scientist, and scientists take a man at his word, and one night at the little desk she asked herself, what if he meant it literally? What if Thomas Harrow, 4 days before he died, had actually put the true data somewhere it could not be reached? She went back to Harrow House, to the study, where her grandfather's thousands of books stood untouched because no one in the family had wanted them, and she remembered a line from one of her grandfather's own letters. "Thomas always said the truth was in the ground, B, and I looked in the ground for 40 years and never found it." In the ground. She had read it as metaphor. Now she stood in the study and looked at the books, and among them, on a low shelf, a run of old bound volumes of soil and geological survey records, the driest matter imaginable, exactly the kind of book a young technician might own and no one else would ever open. Inside the 3rd volume, hollowed carefully into the pages, wrapped in oilcloth, was a sealed metal tin, and inside the tin were Thomas Harrow's original field logs, not the copies, the originals, the deep samples, the migration readings, the map he had drawn of the true plume, dated and signed 4 days before his death, and with them a single sheet in his cramped hand, addressed to no one and everyone. "I, Thomas Harrow, took these readings myself and swear them true. The report is a lie. Mr. Rennick knows it is a lie. If I am not here to say so, this is my saying so." He had hidden the truth in the ground of the bookshelf, where his own brother had looked for 40 years and never thought to look, and it had waited 60 years for the one Harrow with the training to know precisely what those numbers proved. Beatrice sat on the floor of her dead grandfather's study with her dead great-uncle's confession in her hands, and she understood that the case was now not merely strong. It was complete. The 2024 science proved the poison was there. Thomas's 1964 logs proved the Rennicks had always known, and Thomas's signed statement proved they had lied about it, and hinted, in that one terrible phrase, "if I am not here to say so," at what they had done to keep him quiet. The planning committee met on a wet Thursday evening in the council chamber, and the room was full, because the Rennick scheme was the biggest thing to happen to the valley in a generation, and everyone had come. Julian Rennick was there, in the front row, immaculate, gracious, nodding to the counselors he knew. Gerald and Miles Harrow were there too. Beatrice had seen to that quietly, through Edmund Clay, because the poison ran under their land and they had a right to hear it, and because she was not, whatever they had done, willing to let her own family drink that water in ignorance. They sat looking baffled at their own invitation. Gerald had heard, vaguely, that his university niece had been up to something with her worthless field, and had laughed about it at the market. The officers presented the scheme. The Rennick consultant presented the environmental survey, the shallow one, the clean one, the same lie in modern clothes, and concluded that the site was safe. The chair asked whether there were any objections from the public. and Beatrice Harrow stood up. She was not a grieving granddaughter with a grievance. She stood at the microphone in a plain dark suit, and she introduced herself, evenly, by her full name and her qualifications, and as the director of a funded remediation program at Blackmore Rise carried out in partnership with the Brunner Institute of Zurich. And she watched the name land on Julian Rennick's face, and watched him understand, for the first time, exactly who and what he had been fighting. She did not shout, she did not accuse. She did what her grandfather had told her to do. She showed them all at once in the open. She laid out the modern data, the deep samples, the hexavalent chromium, the live migrating plume, the hard figures that could not be argued with. She showed how the Rennick Consultant Survey had sampled only where the ground was clean and never where the poison lay, and she showed the same pattern in the 1964 survey, 60 years apart, the identical trick. And then, when the room was utterly silent, she produced Thomas Harrow's original 1964 field logs, and his map, and his signed statement, and she read the last line aloud into the quiet chamber. "The report is a lie. Mr. Rennick knows it is a lie. If I am not here to say so, this is my saying so. My great-uncle Thomas Harrow took these readings in 1964, she said. He died before he could make them public. The company that employed the surveyors then is the company applying to build here now. It has known for 60 years that this ground is poisoned, that the poison is spreading under this valley's farmland and toward its water. It knew when it buried the truth in 1964, and it knew when it commissioned a survey 8 months ago designed to bury the truth again, this time under 400 family homes." She looked, for the first and only time, directly at Julian Rennick. "I'm not asking this committee to take my word. Every figure I have shown you is independently verifiable. Test the ground yourselves. The poison is there. It has always been there. And these men have always known." She sat down. The reversal was not instant, because respectable men do not collapse in a single scene outside of stories. But it was total. The committee, shaken, deferred the application and ordered an independent investigation. The independent investigation, which Julian Rennick could not control, and God knows he tried, confirmed every word. The hexavalent chromium was there, at depth, exactly where Beatrice said, exactly where Thomas had said 60 years before. The Rennick survey was found to have been designed to miss it, and this time, in 2024, with modern rules and modern scrutiny, that was not a buried embarrassment but a criminal matter. The Environment Agency opened an investigation. The old 1964 fraud, and the questions around Thomas Harrow's death that could now, at last, be asked out loud, went to the police. Julian Rennick did not go quietly, and he did not at first believe himself guilty. She had been right about that. But the proof was in the ground, and the ground does not lie, and one by one the counselors and the newspapers and the charities and the boards that had called him a benefactor fell away from him. Rennick Holdings' great scheme collapsed. The compulsory purchase threat evaporated. You cannot force the sale of the one piece of land that has exposed your entire fraud. And in time, with the criminal investigations closing in and his family name in ruins, the man who had been the most admired figure in the valley faced the consequences of a lie his grandfather had started and he had chosen, knowingly, to continue. He fell through his own respectability, exactly as her grandfather had foreseen, destroyed not by Beatrice's anger, but by his own long-guarded pride. And the land, the pile of muck they had laughed at, made her a millionaire, 3 years later, exactly as the story had promised, though never in the way anyone in that parlor could have imagined. Because Beatrice did not sell it and did not stop. Over 3 patient years, with the Brunner Institute's technology and Anton Brunner's honored debt, she cleaned Blackmore Rise. The engineered mycelial networks she had studied for 7 years drew the chromium up out of the soil and locked it safely away, acre by acre, and the rustandash ground grew, for the first time in 60 years, ordinary and brown and alive. Grass came back to it, then hedgerows, Then, at the far edge, the first trees. And when it was clean, when 212 acres of the most notorious wasteland in the north of England had been certified remediated to the highest standard, at the very head of a valley crying out for the housing the Rennick collapse had left unbuilt, it was no longer worthless. It was the most valuable single holding in the district. Clean, developable, its title watertight, its story famous. Beatrice Harrow, who had inherited a poisoned field her family thought a cruel joke, built on it not 400 houses squeezed from a fraud but a modest, careful development of her own, homes the valley genuinely needed, on ground she had proven safe with her own hands, priced for the people who actually lived there. It made her, quite properly and quite honestly, a very wealthy woman. And she gave the first of the money, before anything else, to the fund she established in Thomas Harrow's name, for the independent testing of contaminated land, so that no other honest young technician's readings would ever again die in a drawer. The emotional ending was a small one, and it happened at the edge of the newly living ground. Gerald and Miles came to see her, once it was all over. They had escaped the water, the plume had not quite reached their wells, and Beatrice's exposure of it meant it never would now. They stood at the edge of Blackmore Rise where the new grass grew, and Gerald, who did not have the words, said only gruffly, "The old man knew what he was about then. Leaving it to you." A long pause. "We didn't know what you were." He could not manage sorry, but he offered his hand, and Beatrice, who had inherited her grandfather's patience along with everything else, took it. Miles said nothing at all for a while, and then he said quietly, "You could have let it poison us. You knew. You could have said nothing and let our land go bad and bought it up cheap and had the whole valley." He looked at her. "Why didn't you?" "Because you're my family," said Beatrice simply, "and because my grandfather taught me that the point was never to win against people, it was to win against the lie." She looked out over the ground that had been dead her whole life and was living now. "You laughed at me in the parlor, that's all right. I'd rather be laughed at and right than admired and wrong. Grandfather knew that too. It's why he never minded being the bitter old man for 60 years. He knew what he had. He just had to wait for someone who could use it." She stood a while longer after they had gone, at the top of the slope where her great-uncle had died and her grandfather had grieved, and she had, at 14, asked not whether the ground was dangerous, but whether it could be made to live again. It could, it had. She had made dead things live, exactly as the old man said she always wanted to. And the lesson of it, the thing she carried down the valley in the evening light, was the one her grandfather had spent his whole life proving and never quite got to say aloud: that the world is very quick to decide what a person is worth, and very slow to check, and that the ones it laughs at and writes off and buries are so often the ones holding the truth it most needs. They had judged her completely wrong. They had judged Thomas wrong and her grandfather wrong, and the poisoned land itself wrong, worthless, hopeless, dead. And every one of those judgments had been not just unkind but incorrect, a failure not of heart but of looking. "Do not mistake what is quiet for what is empty," the valley seemed to say to her as she walked down through the living grass. "Do not mistake the underestimated for the unimportant. And never, ever assume the ground is dead just because everyone has agreed to stop asking whether it might be made to live." She reached the bottom of the slope as the light went gold over the fells, and she did not look back because there was no need. The land was hers. The truth was told, and her grandfather, wherever he was finally, after 60 years, at rest.